It was October 27th, 2021, a day that marked the dawn of a new era in Clash Royale. The Champions update had arrived, and for the first time, Clash Royale players were introduced to Champions. But what was so special about them? Well, they were unique cards with game-changing abilities that were designed to be more powerful and versatile than any regular card. Therefore, Supercell hoped that Champions would add a new strategic element in Clash Royale. But little did they know that their beloved game would never be the same after this. Today we're taking a look at the history of every champion in Clash Royale and the impact they had on the game. Starting off with perhaps the most underrated champion of all, the Golden Knight. The Golden Knight was a 4-elixir ground card with high hit points and moderate damage. His original card concept used to look something like this. But what set him apart from any other troop in the game was his special ability. His dashing allowed him to charge through multiple enemies in a straight line, dealing damage to each target he hit. The dashing dash ability cost 1 elixir and increased the Golden Knight's movement speed when no enemies were nearby. This ability wasn't just about dealing damage, it was about creating chaos in the opponent's defense. Because of this, the Golden Knight was used in a variety of decks like Bridge Spam and Goblin Giant. However, the one deck he was especially popular in was Minor Poison. The Golden Knight served as the pressure card, while Minor plus Poison was the primary win condition of the deck. Combined with Tesla and Royal Delivery, the deck's defense was almost impossible to break. This Minor Poison deck had an incredible 65% win rate. The Golden Knight was especially a counter to Swarm and Bait decks, considering his dash would just one-shot all the Swarm cards. At launch, the Golden Knight was a force to be reckoned with. His ability to bypass troops and target high-value cards made him a nightmare for anyone caught off guard. His synergy with cards like Tornado allowed players to group enemy troops, setting up the perfect scenario for his devastating dash. For a short while, he dominated the meta with his unpredictability and game-changing potential. However, it wasn't long before the community began to feel the overwhelming power of the Golden Knight. His ability to dash unpredictably through multiple troops, sometimes even ignoring defensive structures, led to widespread frustration. Players who couldn't counter his dashes often found themselves quickly overwhelmed. The demands for a nerf were starting, and Supercell had to respond. In February 2022, the Golden Knight received his first nerf. His dash range was reduced from 6 tiles to 5 tiles, and his dash cooldown time was increased from 8 seconds to 11 seconds. This made it such that players wouldn't be able to use his dash too often and would have to be more strategic in deploying him and using his ability. The nerfs encouraged smarter, more tactical play rather than relying on the sheer strength of his ability. The Golden Knight was still quite strong despite the nerfs. Players found him incredibly useful in bridge spam decks since he would synergize really well with other cards of the deck. The deck relied on overwhelming the opponent with constant pressure using cards like the Golden Knight, Elite Barbarians, Bandit, etc. In June 2022, Electro Giant players realized that the Golden Knight could be a key asset to their deck because of its synergy with Tornado. The Electro Giant Tornado push was already annoying to deal against, and now with the addition of Golden Knight, it would just create an unstoppable offense. The log bait players followed the principle of if you can't beat them, join them. Realizing that the Golden Knight countered their decks fairly easily, they decided to use him in their own archetype, and thus the infamous Golden Knight log bait deck was born. The deck had a high 61% win rate and was incredibly spammy and annoying to deal against. Seeing the rising usage and win percentages of Golden Knight, a nerf was evident. In a balance update on 2nd August 2022, the Golden Knight's hit points were reduced by 10%. This was a significant nerf, and one could say perhaps too brutal. The nerf hit hard to the Golden Knight, and he remained pretty much underused for the next year and a half. The only Golden Knight deck that remained somewhat relevant during his dark phase was a Goblin Drill Exonado deck. The deck wasn't the strongest, but at least it didn't let the Golden Knight fade away from the game. After remaining in the shadows for the entire 2023, Supercell finally decided to show some love back to the first champion of the game. The early months of 2024 saw multiple buffs to the Golden Knight. His dash damage was increased by 8%, and his dash's cooldown was reverted back to 8 seconds. Even though the card was far from its glory days, these buffs gave the card some of its popularity back. The Golden Knight has found a permanent place in Goblin Drill decks. His ability to pressure opponents, disrupt defenses, and create opportunities for huge plays ensures he will always have a place in the meta. For many players, he represents the perfect balance between skill, strategy, and chaos. A champion whose mastery can turn the tide of battle in an instant. If the Golden Knight seems broken to you, well, think again. Our next champion on the list was so game-breaking on release that she sparked an outrage within the entire Clash Royale community. Enter Archer Queen. Inspired by Clash of Clans, the Archer Queen sneaked her way into Clash Royale on 27th October 2021 during the Champions update. She immediately stood out for her incredible damage output and her ability to become invisible on command. Her special ability, Cloaking Cape, made her invisible for a short time while greatly increasing her attack speed. This ability allowed her to shred through enemy troops and towers, all while avoiding damage herself. In a game where timing and positioning are everything, this invisibility made the Archer Queen an almost unstoppable force. On release, the Archer Queen was considered overpowered by many players. Her ability to go invisible and rapidly fire at enemies, combined with her already high damage output, made her incredibly difficult to counter. The Archer Queen could single-handedly turn the tide of a match, often eliminating key enemy troops or destroying a tower in seconds. The community quickly recognized the Archer Queen's dominance. Decks featuring her began to appear in almost every match, from ladder play to high-level tournaments. Her versatility allowed her to fit into a variety of archetypes, making her the most popular and powerful card in Clash Royale. The card seemed so unbalanced that within a couple of days of its release, people were demanding a massive nerf to her ability. It was almost unfair that just a 1 elixir cost ability could destroy your entire push, thus giving your opponent a great elixir advantage. But with great power comes the need for balance. As the Archer Queen's dominance grew, Supercell stepped in to make adjustments. On 4th November 2021, just a week after her release, emergency balance changes were announced for the Archer Queen. Her ability duration was reduced from 3.5 seconds to 3 seconds, and her invisibility cooldown was increased from 11 seconds to 15 seconds. These nerfs were meant to tone down her overwhelming presence, but even after the adjustments, the Archer Queen remained a top-tier card. Her ability to cycle through her invisibility still gave her a massive advantage in duels, especially in decks that focused on quick elixir generation or fast cycle. The Archer Queen was incredibly popular in 2 archetypes. The first one was of course Hog Rider. The Hog EQ decks really benefited from the 3-card cycle using the Archer Queen, which allowed the players to cycle the Hog Riders much faster. Combined with a giant skeleton plus bomb tower to take down ground units while having the Archer Queen to shred air troops, the deck's defense was almost impossible to break. The second archetype which saw its rise due to the Archer Queen was the Royal Hogs. Even faster than Hog Rider decks, this archetype was probably the most hated back then. The deck had a cheap defensive combo of Royal Delivery and Cannon, with the Archer Queen doing the heavy damage for defense. These 2 decks dominated the meta for quite a while. The Archer Queen was also being used in those annoying Expo and Giant Graveyard decks. Despite the nerf, a major issue with the Archer Queen was how fast she used to move while being invisible, which led to much more damage. So finally, on 3rd February 2022, Clash Royale nerfed the invisible Archer Queen's speed and made it such that it was a bit slower than usual. Another set of balance changes in April reduced her attack speed while being invisible. These balance changes shifted how the Archer Queen was used in the meta. She was no longer an all-powerful card that could be spammed without consequence. Instead, she became more of a high-risk, high-reward option, with players needing to time her ability carefully to maximize her impact on the game. She continued to remain strong with Royal Hogs and Hog EQ. During this time, a lot of Mortar decks began to utilize the Archer Queen. Mortar decks usually had weaker air defense, so bringing in the Archer Queen solved this issue. And to this date, Archer Queen still remains an important asset for Mortar decks. Throughout 2023, the Archer Queen only received a single balance change. In February, her first attack time interval was nerfed and she would now take 0.2 seconds more to launch her first attack. In September 2023, when Clash Royale collaborated with Chess.com, the Archer Queen was featured as a non-playable opponent in chess. The Archer Queen remained in the shadows throughout 2023, no longer broken as before. Yet she still packed a punch, and Mortar, Hog and Royal Hogs decks continued to show love to their beloved Queen of Clash Royale. In January 2024, the Archer Queen got a buff to her cloaking capability, which was increased by 0.5 seconds. Ever since, the Archer Queen has never really fallen out of the meta and is still used by pros and casuals alike. She didn't just change the decks she was featured in, she changed the way players approach the game. Today, the Archer Queen still stands tall and continues to be a force to be reckoned with. Although the Golden Knight and Archer Queen were extremely strong on release, the third champion was quite underwhelming compared to the other two. But it wouldn't remain like that for long. The third champion was none other than the King of the Undead himself, the Skeleton King. The Skeleton King was released in the Champions update on October 27, 2021. His special ability worked in a fascinating way. As enemy or friendly troops were defeated near him, their souls would be collected into his soul meter. The Skeleton King could activate his soul summoning ability at any time, spawning a swarm of skeletons around him equal to the amount in the meter. This ability made him incredibly dangerous in the right circumstances, as a single well-timed activation could overwhelm opponents, creating an army of skeletons that was difficult to handle. The Skeleton King was considered as the weakest champion of the three upon its release. The main reason was that it had dealt less damage, and it wasn't easy for him to collect souls. Therefore, he only worked well in a limited number of decks. The players were more likely to use the Golden Knight and Archer Queen, both of whom would counter the Skeleton King at that time. Seeing this, there was a demand to buff the Skeleton King so that he could find his place in the meta. Seeing the Skeleton King underperforming in the game, Supercell decided to buff it immediately. Just after a week of its release, he received a major 14% damage buff, increased area radius for his attacks, as well as immunity to knockbacks. These buffs finally made the Skeleton King find his place in the meta as various decks using him began to rise. Because of his soul collecting ability, the Skeleton King became the absolute best card to use with graveyard decks. Drop the Skeleton King on the bridge, followed by the graveyard, and watch him collect all the souls of the skeletons that were spawning from the graveyard. Soon, the Skeleton King's ability would charge up fully and you would have a second graveyard walking towards the tower. Another broken play was playing the Tombstone on the field and then dropping the Skeleton King in the back. The Skeleton King would keep on collecting souls from the skeletons coming out from the Tombstone, and by the time he reached the opponent's side of the arena, his entire ability would have charged up. Graveyard was the strongest deck in the game, and the addition of Skeleton King made it even difficult to beat. The Skeleton King plus Tombstone combo was also used in Lava Hound decks. The skeletons from the Tombstone and the Lava Pups served as the perfect food for the Skeleton King's ability. Combined with the Lava Hound and Miner, the offensive push was unstoppable. The Lava Hound Skeleton King deck was in fact so broken that it finished number 1 in the world in April 2022. Different types of Mortar bait decks were using the Skeleton King too. The high amount of swarm cards present in these decks worked really well with the Skeleton King's ability, leading to massive counter pushes. The Skeleton King's popularity was rising and it was leading to the creation of extremely toxic decks. To prevent the game from going in that direction, Clash Royale nerfed the Skeleton King twice during June and August 2022. The original number of skeletons, which were 20, got reduced to 18 in June and then further got nerfed to 16 in August. These balance changes put a stop to the growing popularity of the Skeleton King and made it extremely balanced. Until date, the Skeleton King hasn't really received any other significant balance change. During the later half of 2022 and early 2023, the Skeleton King was beginning to be used in Royal Giant decks as well. Along with the Tombstone and Fisherman, it provided a lot of outplay potential which the Royal Giant decks relied on. While a lot of Skeleton King decks took a good amount of skill to play, one didn't. In October 2023, when Bat's Evolution was released, it led to the creation of perhaps the most toxic deck in the history of Clash Royale. The Elixir Golem Night Witch deck was invented, and together with the Skeleton King and Elixir Collector, the deck totally shook up the Clash Royale meta. The deck had so little skill involved that you only required a single brain cell to play it. Just pump in the back, drop your Elixir Golem, spam everything behind it, and finally rage the entire push. There you have it, the easiest 3-crown victory of your life. The deck still remains strong and has received perhaps the most hate out of any deck in Clash Royale. The Skeleton King has remained a relevant and powerful card in Clash Royale's meta since his release. His versatility and ability to overwhelm opponents with skeletons ensures he will always be a card that players need to respect. Whether in casual play or at the highest levels of competition, the Skeleton King has solidified his place as one of Clash Royale's most impactful champions. While the original 3 champions have remained fairly balanced throughout the years, the next champion has never really settled down. Let's dig deep into his history. And I mean that literally because, well, it's the Mighty Miner. The Mighty Miner dug his way into the Clash Royale arena on 30th March 2022. Unlike other champions, the Mighty Miner wasn't about overwhelming troops or ranged attacks. He brought a whole new kind of tactical depth to the game. The Mighty Miner has 2 defining features, his drill attack and his special ability, Explosive Escape. As a single target, high damage unit, the Mighty Miner could drill through tanks like golems or giants with ease due to his damage increasing over time, just like the Inferno Tower and Inferno Dragon. But his real trick came with his ability to switch lanes. For a cost of 2 elixir, his Explosive Escape allowed him to burrow underground and reappear on the opposite lane, leaving behind a devastating bomb that dealt area damage. But the Mighty Miner faced an issue on his release. Despite all the cool stuff about him, when players actually used him in-game, they found that his ability wasn't really worth it for the cost of 2 elixir. It took quite long for the bomb to explode, and just wasting 2 whole elixir for some damage wasn't really worth it. Supercell recognized the issue, and on 8th April 2022, the Mighty Miner's ability cost was reduced to 1 elixir and he gained knockback immunity too. Another buff in the same month saw his bomb's exploding time getting reduced to 1 second. So now it exploded much faster and was actually worth the cost. These changes made the Mighty Miner really strong. He started getting used in Goblin Drill decks at first, where his ability to switch lanes was extremely useful. Players would drop the Mighty Miner in one lane, then deploy the Goblin Drill in another lane. As soon as the drill was about to reach the tower, the player would activate the Mighty Miner's ability and teleport him to the other lane, this tanking for the drill. And any defensive troops left behind were blown away from the bomb. Even though the Mighty Miner was a strong card, he wasn't really getting the attention he deserved. This may be because people still prefer the Archer Queen and Golden Knight in many decks. Then in May 2022, a YouTuber named Riley started playing the Mighty Miner with Logbait, and what followed was something no one expected. The Mighty Miner synergized with Logbait so well that the deck took over the entire game. The Mighty Miner combined with Goblin Barrel and Rocket was the ultimate sneaky combo which had tons of outplay potential. Soon, a lot of players on top ladder were using Mighty Miner Logbait and multiple versions of the deck began to appear. People began to recognize the strength of the Mighty Miner, and it was now also getting used in various other archetypes. Hog Rider, Miner Wall Breakers, and even Lava Hound decks started using the Mighty Miner. Seeing the Mighty Miner being overused in the game, Supercell decided to implement a nerf to control its usage. On October 4th, a balance update reduced the Mighty Miner's hit points by 8%. The nerf was brutal, and all of a sudden the Mighty Miner found himself dropping from the meta. Supercell realized their mistake, and in the month of December, they increased the Mighty Miner's movement speed to make up for the reduced hit points. This made the matters even worse, because the increased speed made it such that the Mighty Miner would reach the opponent's towers much faster, making it extremely unfair. He went from being a dead card to the most broken card in the game in a matter of days. Due to this, emergency balance changes were announced for the Mighty Miner, which saw his speed going back to normal, but also a 5% increase in his hit points. This actually made the Mighty Miner much more balanced and skillful to use. During 2023, Lava Hound and Hog Rider cards using the Mighty Miner were becoming popular. Surprisingly, Mortar decks were also using him with much success. A Mighty Miner Mortar bait version was really strong and had an unreal 72.4% win rate. Mighty Miner continued to remain viable in log bait as well. In June 2023, he received a small 2.2% nerf to his hit points. That was the last significant balance change the Mighty Miner received, and ever since, he's remained a card that required both skill and strategy to use effectively. His ability to counter tanks, support quick offensive pushes, and switch lanes for unpredictable plays gave him a significant role in many decks. Pros used him to create innovative strategies, forcing opponents to constantly adapt. The Mighty Miner's impact on the game can't be overstated. He introduced a new layer of strategy that was never seen before in Clash Royale. So far, all of the champions released in the game focused on an aggressive playstyle, but the next champion Clash Royale was gonna release had a completely different playstyle, something that the game had never seen before. After finally waking up from his years of meditation, the Monk made his way to the Clash Royale arena. On 26 October 2022, Clash Royale introduced a Monk who would bring both calm and chaos to the battlefield. Unlike other champions who focused purely on offense, the Monk introduced a more defensive playstyle with his signature ability, Pensive Protection. This ability allowed the Monk to reflect projectiles back at his enemies and knock back melee attacks, all while taking reduced damage. The Monk's ability to reflect spells and ranged attacks made him a powerful defensive tool against high damage spells and ranged troops like Fireball, Magic Archer, and Musketeer. But what made him truly unique was his 3-hit combo attack. With every third strike, the Monk would unleash a knockback that could send troops flying, disrupting pushes and creating opportunities for counterattacks. The Monk's release immediately brought excitement to the community. His ability to reflect spells opened up new strategies that hadn't been seen before in Clash Royale, making him a versatile champion who could turn the tide of battle in a single moment. But as expected, the card was extremely overpowered. The Monk received his first nerf to his ability on 2nd November 2022. Its cooldown time was increased from 15 to 17 seconds. Despite the nerf, the Monk continued to remain broken. In fact, every top player was using the Monk in various decks. The most popular of these was the Mortar Miner Poison deck, which was trending at that time. The Monk protected the Mortar from any projectile attacks, while the Miner and Poison would continue to chip away on the opponent's towers, making the deck frustrating to deal against. One of the other decks that the Monk found his place in was the Royal Hog's Earthquake deck. The Monk's ability to reflect back fireballs synergized really well with the Royal Hogs. If you had a Monk plus Royal Hogs push coming towards you, you had to think twice before even dropping a fireball on it. The popularity of Monk rose to such an extent that Supercell had to deploy a heavy nerf to him on December 2022. His elixir cost was increased from 4 elixir to 5 elixir. This balance change ensured that the Monk remained a strong but not overpowered champion. His ability to reflect damage and knock back troops still made him a tough card to deal against, but players now had to think more carefully about when and how to use his abilities. The Monk's popularity had certainly taken a hit. It was now mainly used in minor poison decks. Supercell gave him a small first attack hit speed buff in February 2023 in an attempt to bring back the card's popularity. It worked, and Monk found his new home in Royal Giant decks. The Monk and Fisherman provided a stable defense for the deck, and the Royal Giant and Phoenix were the heavy damage dealers. With the release of Evolved Firecracker later in the year, the Monk became even more popular since he was one of the best cards to counter her. In 2024, the Monk was falling out of the meta due to the other champions being too strong in the game. New evolutions were being added to the game continuously, and they weren't helping the Monk's cause. So in March 2024, Supercell decided that it was time for another Monk buff. The Monk's hit points were increased by 8%, ensuring he remained on the battlefield longer and thus had more time to activate his ability. Although the buff didn't really increase the Monk's usage rate, he has remained quite balanced since then and hasn't really received another balance change. Maybe we see a rework to the monk soon so that he can finally stop getting overshadowed by other champions. Overall, the monk's impact on Clash Royale has been profound. His unique abilities have reshaped the meta, encouraging more defensive and strategic playstyles while still offering strong offensive potential when used correctly. His balance of power, reflection, and control makes him one of the most interesting and impactful champions introduced to the game. Speaking of impact, perhaps no other champion created an outrage as much as our next and final one. The Little Prince was extremely unbalanced on release. He was hated a lot by the community, and for good reason. His ability to counter massive pushes single-handedly was just unfair. Players were in disbelief that how can Supercell release such an unbalanced card in the game? Calls for an emergency balance change to the Little Prince were made, and Supercell obliged. Within a span of 10 days, the Royal Rescue's dash range was nerfed to 4.5 tiles, its pushback was reduced to 2.5 tiles, and the Little Prince himself would require more hits to change stages of his burst attack. Despite all these nerfs, the Little Prince still remained broken. In the 20-win challenge later in the month, he was the most used champion. He was featured in almost every archetype of the game. Especially with Electro Giant and Goblin Giant decks, the Little Prince was extremely strong since those big pushes were nearly impossible to stop. Another archetype which thrived because of the Little Prince was Minor Poison. The card proved to be really useful with a mini tank and a defensive building to shut down any upcoming push. The deck was quite skillful and every top player in the world was playing it at one point. The outrage against the Little Prince was growing because of his overusage and annoying playstyle. Also, the game had a lot of Little Prince glitches, which some people were taking advantage of. This increased the hate for Little Prince even more, and once again the cries for another Little Prince nerf echoed throughout the community. The early months of 2024 saw some significant nerfs to the Little Prince. In January, his damage was reduced by 9%, and the Guardian's hit points were also reduced by 11%. Since the Little Prince remained too strong regardless, in March 2024, Supercell thought to reduce both his and the Guardian's range. But the major problem was the Guardian's dash, causing too much damage, and for some reason Supercell was not realizing it. During this time, a new Little Prince deck began to rise in the meta. The deck featured an unlikely combo of Princess and Little Prince along with a rocket. Although the deck might have appeared quite skillful, it supported such a toxic playstyle that players couldn't even imagine. The whole point of the deck was just defending the whole game and getting damage through princesses at bridge and rocket cycle in triple elixir. This was an extremely no-skill playstyle, but everyone started using it, making the game more toxic than ever before. Finally, in June 2024, a balance update decreased the Guardian's dash damage by 48.1% and his pushback to 2 tiles. Her first attack time interval was also increased to 0.5 seconds, and her damage was also slightly nerfed. Due to constant nerfs, the Little Prince is no longer the broken card that he once was and has fallen off from the meta. And I think we all can agree that it remains like that for at least a while. Ever since their release, champions have become a key asset to high-level gameplay and have shaped the meta in countless ways. They offer dynamic opportunities for both offensive and defensive plays, and their introduction has kept the game fresh and engaging for players. Their continuous balance changes ensure that they remain fair yet impactful, contributing to Clash Royale's ever-evolving strategy. Even though, with the introduction of card evolutions, champions are no longer considered too strong, their legacy and the impact they had on the game remain unmatched. The legacy of Clash Royale as a game remains great. The game was a phenomenon back when it was released and even won the Game of the Year award in 2016. But what made Clash Royale truly special back then? Watch this video to find out.